Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. We love to dig into big questions here, and today we're taking on one that's been around for centuries. What is art, really?
A huge topic for sure.
Absolutely. We're talking about something that people have been debating probably since those first cave paintings.
I still haven't settled it.
Not even close. But that's why we're here, right? To roll up our sleeves, dive into the source material, and see what insights we can uncover. And I have to say, the material you sent over for this deep dive, really thought-provoking stuff.
Yeah, lots to unpack. We've got some great philosophical texts to guide us, exploring ideas about beauty, emotions, purpose, all those different angles on what art is trying to do, or maybe what we're trying to get out of it.
Because, honestly, when you start thinking about it, it's not such a simple question. What makes something art? Is it just about whether it's pretty? Does it have to move us emotionally? Or is there some deeper purpose?
Right, those are exactly the kinds of questions these thinkers grappled with. And we're going to try to make sense of it all without getting too lost in the weeds of philosophical jargon, of course.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We want to make this accessible. So let's jump right in. One thing that really struck me early on was this idea of responsibility when it comes to expressing ideas, particularly in philosophy.
Yeah, the sources really emphasize clear language, unambiguous.
Exactly. Like, you can't just throw ideas out there all willy-nilly. There's a real emphasis on being precise, on being accountable for what you're saying.
It's like they're saying good intentions aren't enough, especially in philosophy, where you're dealing with such fundamental concepts. If your language is muddy, your whole line of thinking can get bogged down.
It's like building a house on a shaky foundation.
Right. And this idea of welcoming critical feedback, that was interesting. It's not about attacking someone's ideas, but more about refining them, strengthening that foundation. Like in math, you have to be incredibly precise to build on an idea. Same in philosophy. You need that clarity to make real progress.
So it's a collaborative process in a way, even with these big abstract ideas. It's about getting closer to the truth, even if it means revising your initial thoughts.
Exactly. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. A lot of people might assume that art is all about emotions, expressing feelings, that sort of thing. But the sources we have here suggest a more nuanced view.
It's not as straightforward as just, I feel sad, so I'm going to paint a sad picture.
Right, it's deeper than that. One perspective that comes up is Professor Parker's view, and he talks about art as a way of expressing a wish.
A wish.
Yeah, like a desire for something. But then, interestingly, the source contrasts that with Parker's own writing, where he talks about art as expressing feelings. So there's this tension there, even within his own thinking. It's like, is it a wish or is it a feeling? Or maybe both.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because the source points out that even if you believe art's primary purpose is to express emotion, that doesn't mean you have to ignore the fact that expressing that emotion can actually help you understand it better.
Right, so it's not just venting, it's not just letting it all out. There's a clarifying function to expression.
Putting it into words or music or whatever form the art takes actually forces you to grapple with that feeling, to define it more clearly for yourself. And that's something those emotionalist theories, as they're called, don't necessarily have to exclude.
Exactly. It's like by externalizing the feeling, you gain a new perspective on it. You see it in a different light. And the source suggests that it's through this process of objectification, making the internal external, that we can truly grasp the nature of those feelings.
And that's where the subject matter comes in, right? Because it's not just about any emotion. It's about how that emotion is conveyed through the particular subject, the content of the artwork.
Right. The subject matter acts as the vehicle, the medium through which that emotion takes shape. It's the paint on the canvas, the notes in the melody, the words on the page. They're all crucial for giving form to that internal feeling. And the source makes a really interesting point about how our emotions aren't always tied to specific external events. They can be more abstract, more internal, more about the general state of our being.
Right. So a painting of a storm might not be about a literal storm the artist experienced, but more about a feeling of turmoil or upheaval they're going through internally. Okay, let's pivot a little. Another fascinating concept you shared is the play theory of art. Now, I'll admit, when I first heard that, I was a bit puzzled. Play and art, how do those connect?
Well, there's this idea, going back to thinkers like Schiller and Spencer, that there's a fundamental link between art and play. But the source we're looking at focuses specifically on Carl Gruss's perspective, which is a bit more nuanced.
Okay, so how does Gruss distinguish between play and art?
He starts by differentiating between play and work. Play, he says, is autotelic, meaning it's an end in itself. You play for the sheer joy of it. The process itself is the reward.
Makes sense.
Work, on the other hand, is ectotelic, meaning it aims at some external result. You work to achieve a specific goal, to produce something outside of the activity itself.
So play is about the journey, work is about the destination.
Exactly. And then Gruss proposes that art is endotelic.
Endotelic.
Meaning it has an internal aim that's achieved within the artwork itself. So it's not just about the process like play, but it's also not about some external outcome like work. The purpose and value are found within the creation and the final product.
Okay, so the act of creating art and the artwork itself, they both contain the purpose and the value. That's really interesting. And this seems to lead directly into the source's own attempt to answer that big question, what is art?
Right, and it does so by distinguishing between art in general, endotelic art specifically, and then focusing on aesthetic art.
Okay, lots of distinctions there. And there's this term that seems central to it all, objectification. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Objectification, as it's used here, means giving an objective form to something that's internal, a feeling, a thought, even a desire, what they call a volition.
So taking something that's inside your head and making it real, giving it a tangible form in the world.
Exactly. And Source points out that this process can be quite deliberate. It's not just something that happens accidentally.
There's intention behind it. And then there's this really interesting distinction made between refining the product that results from this objectification and trying to change the inner self that's being objectified. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So let's say you're a painter trying to capture a feeling of joy. You start putting paint on the canvas, but it's not quite right. Correcting the product would mean working on the painting itself, adjusting the colors, the brushstrokes, the composition to better express that initial feeling. But correcting the self would mean trying to change the feeling of joy itself before even attempting to paint it. The source seems to suggest that real art making lies in focusing on getting the external form right to match that internal state.
So it's not about altering the feeling, it's about accurately expressing it through the artwork. And what are the two key things that this objectification makes possible? Why is it so important?
Well, first of all, by objectifying that inner state, we're able to step back and look at it from the outside, which gives us a better understanding of it. And secondly, it allows us to share that experience with others, to communicate something that was previously completely internal.
So it's about self-knowledge and communication. Now, the source also talks about how other motives can be involved even when we're creating endotelic art. They use these terms lectical and heretic art. Can you break those down for us?
Absolutely. Lectical art is defined as the objective expression of meanings. So think of writing a report or an essay. The main goal there is to convey information clearly and objectively.
Got it.
Heretic art, on the other hand, is about the conscious objectification of volition or invention. So creating a new tool, designing a system, those would be examples of heretic art. The goal is to bring a desired outcome into reality.
So both lectical and heretic art are endotelic in that their purpose is achieved within the product itself. But then there's aesthetic art, which seems to be what we usually think of when we say art.
Right. And aesthetic art, according to the source, is specifically the conscious objectification of feeling. And it's important to note that this definition tries to distinguish it from non-artistic expressions of feeling, like, a spontaneous laugh or a yawn.
Right. And it's also distinct from skilled craftsmanship that might produce something visually similar. A beautifully crafted table might be impressive, but it's not necessarily art in this sense.
Exactly. And a key point here is that expressing ideas or thoughts that's not considered part of aesthetic art in this framework. It's all about the feeling.
And it's interesting how the source talks about how the feeling captured in a complex artwork can actually develop over time as the artist works on it. It's not necessarily fully formed at the outset.
Yeah, it's like the feeling itself becomes more defined, more nuanced through the process of creation. Okay, let's tackle another big one. The idea that art is all about beauty. This source seems to really push back against that.
Yeah, they pretty much say, hold on a minute, not so fast. They argue that plenty of undeniable works of art, especially in more recent times, are, well, let's just say they're not winning any beauty contests.
And that's okay, they're saying. Just because something isn't conventionally beautiful doesn't mean it's not art. The artist might not have been aiming for beauty at all.
Their goal might have been something else entirely. Maybe they were trying to capture a feeling of anxiety or disgust or some other emotion that we don't typically associate with beauty.
Precisely. The artist's internal question might not be, is this beautiful? But rather, is this true to what I'm feeling? Does this accurately express my inner experience?
So authenticity over aesthetics. And this leads us to a couple of thinkers who really emphasize this idea of art as a language of feeling, Veron and Tolstoy.
Yeah, Veron saw art as a form of communication that evolved from basic human expressions, like crying or gesturing.
Our primal ways of communicating.
Right. And while he recognized that the visual and auditory pleasure of art became important, he argued that the real value of expressive art lies in the depth and sincerity of the feelings being expressed. He really advocated for artists to be genuine, to tap into their personal emotions and express them spontaneously.
And Tolstoy, his view is probably more familiar to people. He also focused on this idea of art as a way to transmit feeling.
Yeah, for Tolstoy, genuine art had this power to infect the viewer or listener with the feeling that inspired it. He contrasted this with what he called counterfeit art, which lacked that authentic, emotional core.
So for both Veron and Tolstoy, it's not about beauty or technique, it's about the rawness and genuineness of the feeling being expressed. Okay, no deep dive into philosophy is complete without a little healthy criticism. And the sources we have here offer some critiques of various theories. Let's start with Croce's aesthetic. Where do they disagree with him?
One of the main sticking points is Croce's idea that intuition and expression are essentially the same thing. The source argues that this doesn't really line up with how we use those words in everyday language. We usually think of them as separate processes.
Right, like you can have an intuition about something without necessarily expressing it. And you can express something without having had a prior intuition about it.
Exactly. There's also a critique of Croce's claim that beauty is something that exists in human activity, not in things themselves.
So beauty is a product of our perception, not an inherent quality of the object itself.
That's Croce's view. But the source challenges this with a really helpful example. The difference between experiencing a work of art directly and then analyzing it later. In the moment, you might have a strong emotional response to a piece of music, but later, when you're trying to intellectually understand it, that feeling might be gone.
So the immediate aesthetic experience is different from the detached intellectual analysis. They're not the same thing, which challenges Croce's idea that beauty is only a product of human activity. Now, the source also takes a critical look at Professor Parker's views, particularly his assertion that art is essentially imagination.
Yeah, Parker's definition of imagination is quite broad. He includes things like springing from a wish, fulfilling that wish, not being real, simulating reality.
And the source points out that a lot of artworks are actually very real physical objects.
Right. And then there's this argument Parker makes that because dream images are impractical and art isn't always treated practically, therefore art is basically just images. The source identifies this as a logical fallacy, specifically the fallacy of the undistributed middle.
Okay, remind us what that means.
Basically, it means that just because two things share one characteristic, in this case, not being treated practically, that doesn't mean they're fundamentally the same thing.
So just because a dream and a painting are both impractical in a certain sense, that doesn't mean they're both essentially just images.
Exactly. And the source also criticizes Parker's attempt to characterize music and dance as always being a form of make-believe. They point out that a dancer is actually physically moving. It's not just a simulation unless it's specifically pantomime.
Right, there's real physicality there. And it seems like the criticism is that Parker is stretching the definition of imagination a bit too far to fit his theory. Now, what about the Freudian idea that art is all about fulfilling unconscious wishes? Does the source give that much weight?
Not really. They mention it briefly, but they seem to align with the earlier critiques of Parker's view that art originates from a wish and seeks to satisfy it. They don't seem to fully endorse that perspective.
Okay, let's circle back to this idea of clarification through expression, because it seems central to the theory the source is building.
Yeah.
How does this emotionalist perspective explain that process of clarification?
Well, contrary to some critiques, this theory suggests that the act of expressing a feeling objectively, whether through speaking, writing, or art, can actually lead to a deeper understanding of that feeling. It's like when we put something into words, we're trying to give form to a meaning that's present in our mind.
There's this interesting distinction made between a meaning in the mind and a feeling. The source uses a really helpful analogy. Imagine understanding a recipe. You have the ingredients, you have the steps, and if you know those, you can pretty much predict the final dish.
That's like a resultant relationship where the whole can be understood from the parts.
But then think about the feeling you get when you hear a piece of music. even if you analyze all the notes, the rhythms, the harmonies, the overall emotional impact is often more than just the sum of those parts.
It's emergent, meaning the whole has qualities that go beyond just the individual components.
Right. So clarifying a meaning involves understanding how those individual parts contribute to the overall meaning, what the source calls disintegrational resultants. But clarifying a feeling is about becoming aware of those emergent qualities, those subtle nuances that can't be fully explained just by analyzing the parts.
And it's through this process of expressing the feeling, of giving it objective form, that we can begin to grasp those disintegrational emergence, those unique qualities that make each feeling what it is.
Okay, let's move on to some of the historical views on art. The source spends some time discussing Plato's idea of art as imitation. What were his main criticisms?
Well, Plato was particularly critical of art forms that he saw as simply copying appearances, especially visual arts like painting and sculpture. He felt like they weren't leading to any real knowledge or virtue. He was worried about the potential for artists to deceive people with illusions, to create something that looked real but wasn't. He saw it as a step removed from the truth, from the ideal forms that he believed represented true reality.
But the source also points out that Plato did acknowledge a higher form of art-inspired art.
Right. He believed that true art came from a kind of divine inspiration, what he called possession by the muses. In this sense, art was more than just skillful copying. It was an expression of a deeper truth that came from beyond the artists themselves.
But the source critiques Plato for lumping even great artists like Homer in with the mere imitators.
Yeah, they argue that even imitative art isn't necessarily driven by a simple mimetic impulse, a base desire to just copy things. And they also point out the obvious problem that imitation theory can't really account for non-representational art forms like music or abstract painting.
Right, how can you explain the emotional power of a piece of music if art is only about imitating the visual world? Okay, moving forward in time a bit, the source shifts to looking at the potential function of art, going beyond just imitation. Darwin's theory of sexual selection comes up. How did he connect art to evolution?
Darwin proposed that certain traits and behaviors, including those that we might consider autistic, evolved because they helped individuals attract mates. So the ability to create something beautiful or impressive would be seen as a sign of fitness, making you more desirable to potential partners.
And this would be especially true for males, who often have to compete for female attention.
Right. But the source raises some questions about this view, especially when you look at the elaborate displays we see in the animal kingdom. They argue that a lot of these features, like brightly colored feathers or elaborate mating rituals, can be explained by other evolutionary pressures, like camouflage or signaling health, without needing to assume that the animals are making conscious aesthetic judgments.
So the peacock's tail might be more about showing off its good genes than about trying to create something beautiful in the human sense.
Exactly. And the source also points out that many animals have different sensory capabilities than humans, so what we perceive as beautiful might not even register to them in the same way.
So Darwin's theory might not fully explain the origins of art. Another thinker mentioned is Marshall, who proposed a broader view of art's function, going beyond just sexual selection.
Yeah, Marshall suggested that art arose from a more general instinctive tendency to please others, not just for mating, but for strengthening social bonds. He saw the artistic impulse as inherently unselfish, driving us to create things that would bring joy and connection to the group.
So art as a form of social glue.
Precisely. But even this unselfish view faces some counter-arguments. The source brings up Baldwin's perspective, which suggests that the desire for social recognition can't be completely discounted. Artists, even if they're not consciously trying to win approval, are still operating within a social context, and that recognition can definitely influence their choices and their sense of self-worth.
It's that age-old tension between creating for yourself and creating for others. Now, let's jump ahead to a more modern perspective. Dewey's instrumentalist theory of art. How did he see the purpose of art?
Dewey saw art as a process of transformation, taking the raw material of our experiences and shaping it into something meaningful. He believed that art happens when we take these basic connections and turn them into something that has significance, that leads to a satisfying experience. And he emphasized the ongoing nature of this experience, especially with fine art, where the objects we create continue to offer us pleasure and stimulate new experiences over time.
And the source's critique focuses on what they see as a blind spot in Dewey's account.
Right. They argue that Dewey doesn't give enough weight to the importance of feeling import in our aesthetic experiences and the role of empathy in connecting with art. They suggest that the act of creating art isn't always about consciously shaping meaning in the way Dewey describes, and that the emotional and empathetic connection we have with the artwork is a crucial element that his theory seems to overlook.
So it's not just about intellectual understanding, it's about feeling it, relating to it on an emotional level. And that brings us to a couple of key concepts that the source emphasizes: empathy and peripathy. Can you explain what those mean in this context?
Sure, empathy in this sense is about interpreting something as if it has its own agency, its own feelings and experiences, and then identifying with those feelings. Not just about feeling sympathy for something, but actually trying to imagine what it's like to be that thing, to experience the world from its perspective. It's also distinct from aesthetic contemplation, which is more about appreciating something for its own sake without necessarily identifying with it.
So if you're looking at a sculpture of a grieving figure, you might empathize by imagining what it would be like to feel that kind of sorrow, to experience that kind of loss.
Exactly. Now, peripathy is a bit different. It's about understanding something in terms of its functional impact on us without necessarily identifying with it emotionally. So you might perceive a sharp object as dangerous because you understand that it could hurt you, but you're not trying to imagine what it's like to be that sharp object.
You're just aware of its potential effect on you.
Yeah.
Okay, the source then introduces two more terms that are central to its own theory: ekepathy and objectification. Can you clarify what those mean?
So ekepathy is basically about deriving a feeling from the aesthetic object itself. It's not about projecting your own emotions onto it, but rather about extracting a feeling that's inherent within the object. And the source argues that this feeling import is a fundamental part of what makes something an aesthetic object. They also connect this to Santayana's idea of expression, which is this inherent quality of things that evokes an aesthetic response in us.
And then there's objectification, which we talked about earlier in a slightly different context.
Right. In this case, objectification refers to the process of giving objective form to that feeling that we've exopathized from the object. So it's about taking that inherent feeling import and expressing it in a tangible form, whether through painting, music, dance, or any other artistic medium.
Okay, so exopathy is about extracting the feeling, and objectification is about expressing it. And from this idea of exopathy, we get to the concept of aesthetic feelings. How are those defined?
Aesthetic feelings are basically any feelings that we experience during aesthetic contemplation. They're distinct from feelings that arise from our practical activities or our intellectual pursuits.
So not the feeling of satisfaction you get from finishing a task, or the excitement of solving a puzzle.
Exactly. Aesthetic feelings are about the pure experience of contemplating an object for its own sake. And the source emphasizes that to maintain this aesthetic attitude, we need to avoid strong practical emotions that might interfere with our contemplation.
So if you're trying to appreciate a painting, you don't want to be distracted by worries about work or anxieties about upcoming deadlines.
Right. Although, sometimes the positive emotions we experience during contemplation can actually help us overcome those distractions.
Like the feeling of awe you might get from looking at a beautiful landscape.
Exactly. And another key point here is that the aesthetic symbol, the artwork itself, is irreplaceable in evoking that specific feeling. You can't just substitute a description of the artwork for the actual experience of encountering it.
So reading a review of a symphony isn't the same as actually hearing it performed live.
Right. And the source suggests that aesthetic contemplation opens us up to a much wider range of feelings than we typically experience in our everyday lives. It's like we become more attuned to these subtle, often unlabeled feelings that we might not even have words for.
Because in our day-to-day lives, we tend to focus on the practical, functional aspects of things and the feelings that go along with that.
Yeah, we're constantly evaluating things based on whether they're useful or dangerous or helpful or harmful. But aesthetic contemplation allows us to step back from that and just experience the pure feeling quality of something. It's like shifting from thinking about the color blue as a piece of information about the sky to experiencing the pure blueness itself as an aesthetic object.
Okay, that's a really interesting distinction. Now, the source goes on to explore the nature of aesthetic objects themselves, breaking them down into two fundamental aspects: design and dramatic.
Right. They argue that pretty much every aesthetic object can be understood in terms of how its elements are arranged, its design, and how it relates to action, experience, and our desires and aversions, its dramatic qualities. And often, one of these aspects will be more prominent than the other.
So a piece of music might be primarily about its design, the way the melodies, rhythms, and harmonies are structured, while a play might be more about its dramatic qualities, the characters, the conflicts, the resolution.
Exactly. And the source proposes two main types of aesthetic objects: designs, which are essentially arrangements of elements, and dramatic entities, which are like agents or patients involved in some kind of action, or instruments that facilitate action.
Okay, so a painting could be a design based on its composition and use of color, or it could be a dramatic entity depicting a scene with characters in a story.
Right. And both designs and dramatic entities have form and content. Design and time is what we experience as rhythm, for example, in music, while design and space is what we see in painting and architecture. Dramatic relations, on the other hand, are what the source calls telic, meaning they're connected to our desires and aversions.
So a character's actions in a play are driven by their desires and their attempts to avoid what they don't want. And it's interesting how even everyday objects can become dramatic entities depending on the context.
Exactly. A chair is just a chair until it's used in a play to symbolize something else, to become part of the dramatic action.
And it seems like paintings can often straddle that line between design and dramatic entity.
Absolutely. We can appreciate a painting for its purely visual qualities, its composition, its brushwork, its use of color, but we can also interpret it as representing a scene with characters and a story.
And the source points out that historically, there's been more emphasis on that dramatic aspect of painting.
Yeah, they argue that the design aspect is often less consciously noticed, but still crucial. And they caution against focusing too much on one at the expense of the other.
So don't get so caught up in the brushstrokes that you forget about the story the painting is trying to tell. And then there's this interesting distinction made between a representational picture and an illustration.
Right. If we approach a picture as an object of aesthetic contemplation for its own sake, then it's not really an illustration, even if it was originally intended as one. It's about how we engage with it, not just what the artist's original intention was.
So a botanical illustration could be a work of art if we appreciate it for its beauty and its skillful execution, even if its original purpose was purely scientific.
Exactly. And the source also warns against letting too much technical knowledge get in the way of our enjoyment of art. They use this term coroners of art to describe people who overanalyze, who dissect everything to the point that they lose the ability to just experience it.
So don't get so bogged down in the technical details that you forget to actually feel something.
Right. And they emphasize the importance of having a direct first-hand experience with art rather than just relying on second-hand interpretations.
See the painting in person, hear the music live, experience it for yourself rather than just reading about it.
Exactly. Because ultimately, they argue, aesthetic evaluation is all about our immediate feeling, the pleasantness or unpleasantness we experience during contemplation. And this is what distinguishes aesthetic evaluations from non-aesthetic ones.
So judging a painting based on its historical significance or its market value, those would be non-aesthetic evaluations.
Right. And only aesthetic objects can be aesthetically evaluated in this way. Which brings us to a discussion of aesthetic values. Things like beauty, ugliness, the sublime, the tragic, the comic. Let's start with beauty, since it's such a loaded term. How does the source define it?
They offer a fairly specific definition. Beauty, in this sense, is an object that evokes pleasant feelings in us when we contemplate it, and when it approaches a certain standard of perfection.
And that standard of perfection depends on whether we're talking about a dramatic entity or a design. For a dramatic entity, like a character in a play, the standard is how well the feeling itself is expressed.
So a well-written character whose emotions feel real and relatable would be considered beautiful in this sense.
Right. And for a pure design, like a geometric pattern, the standard is the most pleasant, comparable aesthetic experience we can recall.
So it's relative to our own personal experience.
Exactly. Okay, what about the sublime?
The sublime is all about feeling overwhelmed by something vast and powerful, whether it's a towering mountain range or a raging storm.
Right. It evokes this sense of awe and wonder, maybe even a touch of fear. And it can arise from either identifying with the object, empathizing with its power, or from perceiving its impact on us, peripathizing it.
So you might feel the sublime by imagining what it would be like to be that powerful storm. Or you might feel it by recognizing how small and insignificant you are in comparison.
Exactly. Now, tragic pleasure seems like a bit of a paradox. How can something sad be pleasurable?
Well, the source argues that tragic pleasure comes from a sense of gaining wisdom and insight into the nature of suffering and loss. This understanding can actually lead to a feeling of being above the pity and fear that we might normally experience in those situations.
It's that classic idea of catharsis, of purging those negative emotions through art.
And then there's the comic, which is more than just being funny, according to the source.
Right. They describe the comic as involving a sudden realization of a mismatch between our expectations and reality, which leads to a kind of intellectual delight in recognizing the error.
So it's that aha moment when you realize something is absurd or incongruous.
Exactly. And this pleasure is primarily intellectual, not necessarily malicious. It's about enjoying the cleverness of the setup and the surprise of the punchline.
Okay, now that we've explored all these different aesthetic values, let's talk about the role of criticism. If aesthetic judgments are so personal, is there even such a thing as objective criticism?
Well, the source acknowledges that aesthetic evaluation is inherently subjective, like judging food or wine. What one person finds beautiful, another might find repulsive.
So there's no accounting for taste.
Right. But they argue that criticism of art itself is about how successful the artist has been in giving objective form to their feeling.
So it's not about whether the critic personally likes the artwork, but about whether they can recognize the feeling the artist is trying to express.
Exactly. And they suggest that the critic's role is to determine if the artwork objectifies a feeling that they recognize or are willing to accept as their own.
And this gets into the tricky question of how we can even know if someone else is feeling the same thing we are.
Right. The source points out that when we agree with someone about how an artwork makes us feel, we're essentially relying on the assumption that because they're saying they feel the same way, they must be experiencing it the same way internally. But of course, there's no way to know for sure.
We're just inferring based on their behavior, their words, their expressions. And then there's this idea of the connoisseur, which they define not as someone who just has a lot of knowledge about art, but as someone who can actually feel the subtle nuances of aesthetic experience.
Exactly. They have a highly developed ability to discern those fine-grained differences in feeling that a less experienced viewer might miss.
So they're not just intellectually understanding the art, they're viscerally experiencing it.
Right. And this leads to the idea that the art critic's job isn't just to share their own personal opinions, but to guide others in their contemplation, to help them see those feeling qualities that they might not have noticed on their own.
So it's about opening up new avenues of experience for the viewer or listener. And the source makes a really important point about objective statements regarding beauty.
Yeah, they argue that any statement about beauty needs to specify who is making the judgment. You can't just say, "This is beautiful," without acknowledging that it's your personal opinion.
Because what's beautiful to one person might be hideous to another.
Exactly. And they point out that trying to prove beauty through things like popular consensus or the test of time is ultimately futile.
Because those are just measures of popularity or longevity, not of inherent beauty.
Right. And they go on to discuss different types of art criticism, like analytical and diagnostic criticism, which focus on identifying the specific.